Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 19 today, and I will start with another poet and his other poems with you. In the last lecture we looked at the poetry of Matthew Arnold, and I discussed with you his two poems, The Last Word and Growing Old. In today's lecture we're going to start with a 20th century poet called William Yeats. And Yeats is a very, very prominent poet of the 20th century, and he is basically an Irish poet. So he reflects in his poems the troubles and the problems of his own country, that is Ireland. You need to know a little about the history of Ireland before we proceed with the poem. In fact, the first poem that I'm going to do with you that is called the Easter Rising 1916. That's totally seeped in Irish history. That is seeped in the Irish insurgency, and that it's about the Irish struggle for freedom from Britain. Now, up till the 20th century, Ireland was a dominion, was part of Britain. It was part of the British Empire, and in the 19th century, in fact, in the beginning of the 19th century, England had made empires all over the world, but Ireland was retained as part of Britain. So the Irish people resented this rule of Britain government, and they wanted an independent rule. They wanted an independent government. They wanted to be freed of the tyranny of the British, as they described it. Because Britain had hold over its economic and its trade progress. So they wanted an independence from this powerful rule of Britain. They wanted their own independent government. They wanted their own independent parliament. They wanted to make their own decisions for their country, and they saw the British rule as an alien rule. You can compare it to a lot of countries in today's world which are fighting for their independence from a control, from a government. Like we can talk about Kashmir, which is a problematic area, which became part of India, but there's an independent struggle still going on in Kashmir for complete freedom from the state rule of India. So the Irish freedom struggle is similar to that. It is for the people to demand, to fight for their own rights, to fight for their own demand, to fight for their own freedom, to fight for their own independence. And they do not accept the authority of the alien power, the British power over them. So Yeats, born in Ireland, born in Dublin, reflects the freedom struggle of Irish people in most of his poems. But he's a very well-known Irish poet, and he's a very prominent 20th century poet. He was born in 1865 and he died in 1939, as you can see. And as I've just told you, he's an Irish poet, dramatist, and a prose writer. He was educated in London and in Dublin both. He was a member of Theosophical Society, whose mysticism appealed to him as it offered a form of imaginative life far removed from ugly worldly realities. So, but it is important that you understand this also. He was not part of any religious society. This was a mystical society, the Theosophical Society, and a lot of images of mysticism are to be seen in Yeats's poetry, and that is because of his association with the mystical societies in the period. And it offered to him not a realistic but an imaginative picture of the world. And so, in fact, he sought to be away from the real world. And as you shall see that he took part in the Irish nationalist cause also, and most of his poetry reflects this Irish nationalism. He, along with Lady Gregory and others, was one of the originators of the Irish literary theatre also, which gave its first performance in Dublin in 1899 with Yeats's play The Countess Kathleen. So he is the Irish Renaissance. The Irish Renaissance in literature is also attributed to him. Like I've just told you, he gave birth. He started with the Irish literary theatre, and the theatre also started with the first performance on Yeats's own play. So to the end of his life, Yeats remained a director of this theatre, which became the Abbey Theatre in 1904. He also published several volumes of poetry, notably poems, in 1895 and The Wind Among the Reeds in 1899, which are typical for their dreamlike atmosphere and use of Irish folklore and legend. So he does create a dreamlike atmosphere in his poems. So the description is significant for you. You shall see that his poems he takes you, although they are embedded in the Irish folklore legend and the Irish nationalism, but he creates for you a dreamlike state, a dreamlike world, and he dissociates you from that ugly reality, and from that dreamlike state you're able to view that reality objectively. In his early verse, he displays debt to Edmund Spenser, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and pre-Raphaelite poets. One or two poems that I'll do with you, you shall see that you shall see the influence of pre-Raphaelite poets on him. This pre-Raphaelite was a group of poets who were associated, who were basically painters, musicians, artists of other kinds, sculptors. This was a group of poets who sought inspiration from poets before the Renaissance period, before Raphael, the great Italian poet. They sought inspiration from the medieval period, the medieval art and architecture. And the medieval sense of art and paintings is exhibited in their work, and not the Renaissance influence. So their poetry is gives a sharp. It's about sharp colors, sharp profusion of colors, bright colors, and sharp colors are used. We shall see Yeats also experimenting with them, and their paintings are highly symbolic also, as we shall see that Yeats's own poems are also highly symbolic. So he belongs to the this category of poets, the pre-Raphaelite, in that sense, because of the sharp colors that he uses and because of the symbols that he employs. And Shelley, with Shelley, we shall see as Shelley, he is more like a reformer, talking about looking optimistically towards future and seeing a change for his people. His later poetry discards the outwardly ecstatic atmosphere of these early lyrics and shows a new direction where Yeats confronts reality and its imperfections. And later on, so we see him as a maturer poet and becoming aware of his responsibility and confronting reality more strongly and bravely. But for Yeats, the relation between the imagination, history, and the occult remains indispensable. This is really important. You shall see that for Yeats can never dissociate all these three: imagination, history, and the occult, the mysticism. They play an important role in his poetry. In 1922, on the foundation of the Irish Free State, Yeats accepted an invitation to become a member of the new Irish Senate. He served for 6 years, and in 1923 he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So in 1922, Ireland became an Irish Free State, and he became a member of the Senate. And in 1923, he was also awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. The poem, The Easter Rising, that we shall study today, the Easter Rising is basically about a rebellion. The rebellion which took place mostly in Dublin city, which lasted from April 24th to April 30th, 1916. It is called the Easter Rising because it was planned on the Easter Sunday. This is why we call it the Easter Rising, and rising suggests the rebellion. The insurgents, meaning the rebels, they included 1,200 men and women from the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. You can see from these groups of armies, or from these groups of insurgents, that Irish freedom struggle, or a struggle for Irish nationalism, was already ahead, had gone ahead. The small groups had been formed in Ireland, and all of them working for Irish freedom, working towards Irish nationalism. And these, out of those groups, these three groups, including Irish Volunteers, Irish Citizen Army, and Irish Republican Brotherhood, they joined hands, and they planned a rebellion on the Easter of 1916. And this uprising was planned in secret by 7 men, mostly of the Irish Republic Brotherhood. So IRB, or Irish Republic Brotherhood, played an important part in the Easter Rising. And this rising was so planned in secret by 7 men belonging to IRB, who had formed a military council just before the outbreak of First World War. Now, in the backdrop of the poem, it's also important that you remember that this rebellion, or this Easter Rising, it took place when the First World War was already going on. The First World War had started in 1914, and it was already in progress. And it was in the middle of the war that these Irish insurgents, rebels, or freedom fighters, they planned this rebellion against the Britain government. So it was a very clever decision on their part, but as you shall see later, that it backfired. The leaders were Tom Clark, Dean MacDormand, Patrick Pearse, Thomas McDonough, Joseph Plunkett, James Connolly, and Eamon Cant. These are the names of the 7 leaders who planned this rebellion, and who wanted to achieve through this rebellion an Irish free state. Their plans were not known to the members of the Volunteers or the leaders of the IRB. So secret was their planning that when these 7 men had planned this insurgency, they did not inform the other members of their groups. And when the plans were revealed to the leader, Eoin MacNeill, not even all these leaders were aware of the plans. So when the plans were revealed to this to the leader, Eoin MacNeill, at the last minute he tried to call it off, but he was only able to postpone the event from Easter Sunday to the next Monday. So instead of the rebellion as it was planned to take place on Sunday, in the Easter Sunday, which was a holiday for all people, it was postponed, but only postponed a day later, which was on Monday. The insurgents actually took hold of places around Dublin. They occupied the General Post Office of Dublin. They occupied the Four Courts, the South Dublin Union, the Boland's Mill, the Stephen Green and Jacob's Biscuit Factory. So this was what these insurgents did. They took hold of these important places around Dublin. But what did the British government do? To suppress the uprising, the British deployed over 16,000 troops, artillery and naval gunboat. So the British government was not was not ready to take it lightly. They took decisive step to suppress this uprising, and they used 16,000 troops and also employed artillery and naval gunboat to bring it down. So you can see a very strong and harsh reaction was taken, a military reaction was taken by the British government against these civilians. And after a week's fighting, this uprising, it continued for a week, and there was fighting between the British armed forces and the insurgents, and it continued for a week. And at the end of the week, 450 people were killed and over 2,000 wounded. But the rebels' headquarters, which was a GPO, it was bombarded, heavily bombarded, and they eventually surrendered. Patrick Pearse was released the order of surrender on Friday, 28th April. And he was forced, in fact, one of the leaders, he was forced to release the order of surrender. And these insurgents or rebels, they had also arranged, in fact, with the Germans, and this which infuriated the British government most. In the First World War, the British government was engaged against the Germans. And these leaders, most of them were socialists, and most of them had sympathies with the Germans and the Russians. They had sought help from the Germans, and the Germans had actually agreed to supply them with weaponry. So they had arranged with the Germans for an importation of arms, which was to be delivered to them on the Friday, 21st April, that is a week before the insurgency. But this shipment was discovered by the British government, and it could not reach the insurgents. But the rising, although it had the sympathy of the Irish people, but it was not widely supported by the Dublin public, and it was condemned, in fact, also by the Irish Parliamentary Party. So not many people supported this insurgency also. Even Irish people did not support it. But the repression or the suppression, along with the continued postponement of the Home Rule and the growing casualties of the First World War, it helped increase the strength of the future nationalist parties like Sinn Féin. The three factors, combined with the way this insurgency was suppressed or repressed, it gained sympathy of the Irish people. This military attack against the civilians and so much killing and bloodshed of the Irish people, that eventually led to stronger sympathy from the Irish civilians for these people. In fact, it did the uprising, although in fact it did not achieve any of its goals through the uprising, through the rebellious act itself, but it became an important date in the Irish history, and it became an important memory for Irish people, because they would always associate with this date the struggle for the Irish independence and the struggle against the hegemony, against the power of the British rule. Alongside that was also this tendency of the British government to continue postponing the agreement on the Home Rule. In fact, before the First World War commenced, the British government had promised with the Irish parliamentarians that it would grant Home Rule to Ireland after they agreed to send or to take part or to take side with the British in the Second World War, and to provide soldiers in the war for them. So many of the Irish people were recruited into the British Army and were forced to fight their war because they were promised that for this sacrifice they will be given Home Rule at the end of the First World War. But Britain maybe needed this insurgency or rebellion as an excuse, because this home rule, even after the war ended, the bill was not passed. It was not given to the Irish Ireland people or the Irish people. And also in the First World War, many soldiers died, many Irish people also died. So this also resulted in a strong feeling of hatred in the Irish citizens against the British government. Now, before we look at the poem, just a brief history of the Irish freedom struggle. In the 1600s and the 1700s, there were bloody wars and rebellions against the British rule. And in 1830s and 1860s also we see that there were rebellions against British rule, and mostly by IRB, which were known as the Fenians, after the mythical Irish army in the past. They call themselves Fenians. So you see that in the preceding centuries also, this Irish freedom struggle, a rebellion against British rule, had continued in the 17th century, the 18th century, and in the 19th century also. So for centuries, these people, the Irish people, were fighting for self-rule, for fighting for independence, fighting for freedom. And by 1880s, the resistance to British rule had become more effective, because they then had started using or employing more democratic methods. Instead of just an armed rebellion against the British rule, they had by then started to work on more democratic approach. And the Irish Home Rule Party, in fact, campaigned for home rule for Ireland. So they engaged in discussion with the British government, and they campaigned for the home rule for Ireland, which meant that Ireland would still be part of the British Empire, but would at least have its own parliament, which would decide its own future. So it would not be a complete independence, but a partial independence for Ireland. Twice, British government rejected these demands. And at the time of the First World War, the Irish MPs agreed to encourage the volunteers to serve in the British Army, and in return expected home rule after the war ended. I've just told you this. So this is the background to the poem. The poem, as I've just told you, is steeped in Irish nationalist history. The poem is about the national struggle for freedom of Ireland. It is for the freedom from the British rule. And the poem focuses on that one event in history. It focuses on that one event in history which failed and where many lives were lost. But as Yeats is going to tell us, that those leaders became heroes. They became martyrs. Their deaths, although they could not achieve much, but their deaths were not in vain. Their deaths were not useless. Their deaths were not meaningless. They had given a stronger message with their own sacrifice, with their own blood, and with their own deaths to the Irish people than they could have done in any other way. Because so we shall see that he describes it as a great event in history. He describes the people in the poem. He describes the people who took part in this rebellion, which took place in the Easter 1916. So let us analyze the poem now. And because there's more to the Irish history, but we will gradually understand it as we discuss the poem. In the very opening line, he describes to you those people, and he tells you that he knew them personally. He knew them, these people, personally. He says, I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have met them at close of day. So he says, by evening time, I have met so many of them, because most of them He says, I met them coming with vivid, clear faces. He pictures them clearly. He can picture them even clearly now. So he's describing to these people, describing to us these peoples as if they are still alive. They're not dead. So he says, I have met these people with their vivid faces, coming out of their offices among great 18th century houses. These are the houses, this was how the houses in those times looked. They were built around in the 18th century, so they were old houses. And when Keats was writing, it was Yeats was writing, it was 20th century. So he says, okay, they were, and so they all looked the same. They were grey 18th century houses. So he met them coming out of their offices in the evening. And then he says, I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words. So here he's just telling us that he shared light talk with them also. Not important, they didn't talk about something important, about Irish history, about Irish nationalism, about the freedom struggle. He says, we shared light talk. Sometimes I passed them with a nod of the head, acknowledging them, or sometimes with polite, meaningless words, just saying hi, hello, and talking after each other's health, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless, or we stopped together for a while and we exchanged polite, meaningless words. And thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe, to please a companion around the fire at the club. He says, and thought, he says, before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe. Mocking tale or a jibe, this is a mocking remark, or an insulting remark. He says, or sometimes I shared with them or cracked with them these jokes, which are supposed to make us laugh, or passed taunts at them. Sometimes to please a companion, he says, when we were all gathered around the fire at the club. So sometimes he says, I met them while coming down the stairs of the Parliament houses. I met them coming out in the evening from their offices, and while they were going back home or to the club. So he says, I met them again in the club in the evening time, and I shared a mocking tales or a jibe with them. And we shared those light, relaxed moments around the fire at the club, in the comfort of the club. So he's describing to us his meeting with those people who were now gone, who were now no more, who had died as a result of the Easter Rising, who had took part in the Easter Rising, and he brings them alive before us. He makes them alive before us. Being certain that they and I but lived where mortally is worn, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. He says, being certain that they and I but live where mortally is born. So now he's describing to you this this Irish mystery. He says, where they and I, we lived, it was like a place where mortally is born. Mortally refers to this colorful, different colors. So he says, all of us, all of these people share different tastes. They were all different individuals. They were all individuals with their individual tastes, with their individual manners, with their individual characteristics. But he says, now what has happened? The last two lines are significant. He says, all changed utterly. He says, all that has changed now. I will no more meet them coming down the steps from their offices. We will no more share jokes around the comfort of a club fire. We shall no more nod at each other. I shall no more smile at them, or they smile at me. He says, all that has changed. A terrible beauty is born. He's referring to the sacrifice, and he calls that sacrifice terrible as well as beautiful. And most critics have described this as the ambivalence in Yeats' poem, the ambivalent attitude of Yeats towards the uprising. He calls it a terrible beauty. It's terrible. Terrible is something that fills us with terror and fear, and beauty is something that is glorious. So he calls it both. He says it is terrifying also, the event, the uprising, the revolt, the rebellion. It is terrifying, the bloodshed and the way it all took place. It was all terrifying. It has struck fear in our hearts. But at the same time he calls it beautiful. He says, but it is beautiful because their names are now written as martyrs now. They have become heroes now. So he merges the two sensations. He calls it terrible, but he calls it beauty. So it's a beauty that inspires awe and fear, but also respect. The next stanza, which is quite long too, in this stanza he describes to us one by one the different people that he knew. So he's going to introduce those people to us, and he's going to yet again build up their picture as if and we will be able to see them as if they are alive. He says, that woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. This woman is one of those who took part in the rebellion. She was one of the 17 women who participated in the uprising, and she surrendered along with the others, was taken imprisoned, but she was not given the death sentence, but her death sentence was changed into life sentence, but was later on released. This woman is Constance Harquise. She was a member of the Irish Citizen Army. So again we shall see this ambivalent attitude of Yeats towards this uprising. He says that woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, because although you have to understand that although Yeats sympathized with the spirit of this uprising, but he is not totally he does not totally agree with them. He does not totally believe them to be right. And although he was part of the nationalist struggle for Ireland, he himself never took active part in this political or the military struggle for the freedom of Ireland. He did not think that that was the right way. So he was an intellectual, and he believed in not in taking things into their own, in your own hands. So he did not favor this rebellion. He was not even part of it also. But because he knew those people, and he also resented the military action taken by the British government against his people, he sees them as heroes. So there is this ambivalence in his attitude. He did not sympathize with the way they had taken things into their own hands, with the way they had, resulted in the deaths of so many people. He does not like that also. He does not admire that also. And he does not appreciate this sense, their sense of this freedom struggle. Yet he finds it glorious, because it was a sacrifice. It was a sacrifice against the despotic rule, against the military might of the British rule. So there is this ambivalence that is to be found in the poem also. So when he describes this woman as spending her day in ignorant goodwill, she says he means that when she tried to motivate people against the British rule or to take up arms against the British rule, she did not understand the true scale of her own words. She did not know what she was talking about. So this is why he could describe it as ignorant goodwill. She was doing it in goodwill. She meant the freedom of Ireland. She meant to free the people, Irish citizens, of the British rule. But he says she was ignorant. She's ignorant that this was not the right way, that this way would lead to deaths of so many people. So he's describing it as ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. So in trying to convince people to take up arms against the British rule, this meant trying to convince people. And he says she was so passionate about it that she spoke until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? You see, the love for that woman comes now. He says, but she had a voice sweet. There was no voice that could be sweeter than hers. She was young and she was beautiful. So there comes a love and sympathy for these rebels. She rode to the harriers. Harrier is the club, name of the club that they used to gather. So he makes her alive with his description. But you see that ambivalent attitude. Sometimes he despises their actions, her action, and then the next moment he is remembering her with love and respect. Then he talks about another person. He says, this man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. So these two are the teachers, two teachers, Patrick Pearse and Thomas MacDonagh, the two leaders of the Easter uprising also. And he says, this man, the first one, Patrick Pearse, he ran a school and rode our winged horse. Winged horse is Pegasus. The winged horse in Greek myth, the Pegasus, with who was an inspiration, who's referred to, who brings to our mind the 9 muses, which are inspiration for poets. So he was an inspiration. Patrick Pearse was an inspiration for these rebels, for all the insurgents. They all were inspired by him. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He says, and the other one, Thomas MacDonagh, was also following in his footsteps. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. And now he's talking about MacDonagh, and he says he may, and also about Pearse, he says they may have won fame in the end. And he was so sensitive, he had such a sensitive nature, and such daring and sweet in his thought was he, that he could have gone on to become a very famous person if he had not been killed. So you see, he's again he's presenting these people, these rebel leaders, in that admiring light, and in their true colors, and as presenting them as heroes for people. Then he describes another person. He says, this other man I had dreamed, a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. This other man is John McBride, and the reason Yeats uses derogatory words for him is because John McBride married the woman Yeats loved, Maud Gonne. And she was also an activist, but she refused Yeats and she married John McBride. So he calls him a drunken, vain, glorious lout. He describes him as a proud person. A lout means fellow. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, he says. The marriage between Maud Gonne and John McBride was not successful, and it survives only for a year, I think, and then McBride left Maud Gonne. So this is why he's describing his act. He tells us here that he had done a bitter wrong to someone who is near my heart, and this person is Maud Gonne. But he says, yet I number him in the song, yet I remember him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn. Transformed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So he says, no matter how angry I am with him, no matter how poorly I look at him, I describe him, he says, but he has also played his part. But he has also, will also talk about him in my poem, because he has also been changed as a result of his sacrifice. So he has also become a hero now. He's become a heroic figure. So he says, this is why again he goes on to say, he says, transformed utterly. All of these people, he says, have been transformed utterly and changedly. He says, it doesn't matter how I saw them when they were living. Now all that has changed. They are changed utterly, transformed utterly for me now and for the rest of the Irish citizens. And again he repeats the same line, a terrible beauty is born. And the beauty which is created with their own blood, that is born. But there is still, you see the ambivalence when he gives you this phrase, a casual comedy. So he says, in the casual comedy, he describes this rebellion or the act as casual, and then he describes the comedy. So in all of this, he says, in the whole of the scene, which was needless. In Yeats's opinion, it was needless. It need not have happened. And this is why he describes it as a casual, not something that was thought over seriously, whose consequences were thought about seriously by the leaders. And it was like a comedy because, again, it was devoid of seriousness or serious thought. So, but he says, that does not matter. That is all gone and past now. Well, now what we see is that all of that has changed, and they have all become heroes, heroic figures, and they're all martyrs now. Then in third stanza, he is going to use a metaphor for us, and he's going to use the metaphor of a running stream. And he says, just like a small stone cannot stop the flow of water in a running stream, he says, this rebellion, this rising, this uprising cannot do much in the events of Irish freedom struggle. So through this metaphor, again, he is trying to show to us how futile this uprising was, how meaningless it was, how needless it was. He says, hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream. He says, describes these people's vision as hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem. He says, hearts were joined with one cause. They were one with one cause, with one ideology, and they wanted freedom from the British rule through this rebellion. So he says, but these people, he's compared their hearts to a stone. He says, just like a stone cannot trouble the living stream, it cannot stop the flow of the water of a stream which is flowing. In the same way, these people, they cannot stop the change or change the course of events. They have not been able to achieve anything. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. Now, then he's describing to you the law of nature. He tells you that in the nature there is constant change. Nothing is static. Nothing can stop the flow of nature. Nothing can stop the tide of nature. So the change is to come. Change will come. He says the horse moves down the road. The rider, the birds, they're all moving. Minute by minute, he says, they are changing. All objects of nature, they are changing. Nothing is stationary. So he says the events, the historical events, they are not static. They will change. Minute by minute, they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. Again, further images from nature he gives you. He talks about the shadow of the cloud moving upon the surface of the stream, which he says changes minute by minute. Horse's hoof slides on the brim and a horse splashes within it. Then he describes to you the water, the horse riding through water and splashing water around it. So there's movement in nature. So the law of nature is that law of nature is change. Law of nature is that nothing is can stay at one place. Nothing can stay remain static for a long time. So in these lines, he's giving hope, or he's giving a message of hope to his people that things are moving towards a change. He says their troubles, their plight, the plight of the Irish people, the plight of the Irish citizens, it is not going to stay like this forever. It's going to change. So there is this one message for his people of change. At the same time, there is his reference to this uprising and the rebellion, which he says was not carefully thought about, which was not carefully planned, which he compares to a stone in a stream. He says just like a stone is unable to stop the course of flow of water, this uprising is also unable to achieve its objectives. It cannot change the course. It was unable to change the course of events. Long-legged moor hens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Now in these last lines, after that ambivalent attitude towards the uprising, he tells you that the event is still significant. He's given you pictures of further pictures from nature, like the moor hens and the moorcocks. He says, talks about the moor hens diving and the moorcocks calling, the moving and the motion in nature. He says, minute by minute they live. Every object of nature lives from minute to minute. The stones in the midst of all. He says, but the stone is in the middle of all. It cannot be neglected. So this uprising will not be forgotten. This uprising will not be erased from the memories of the people now. Things will move on. All of us will move on. The Irish nationalist cause will move on. But this stone, this rebellion, this uprising will stay in the middle of it all. It will always be remembered. It will always be cherished. It will always be seen as a first bold step to the freedom struggle. So he says that their sacrifices, although they were not able to bring about an immediate change, it says he still says, but it had an impact, and it will be remembered. In the next stanza, he says, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? Now there is pain. He says, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of a heart. He says when the sacrifice becomes long, and he's referring to the long struggle of the Irish people. He says the hearts become of stone. And the hearts of the British people, he says, they have become like stones. They have now become feelingless. They have no feeling now for the sacrifices of the Irish people. Oh, when may it suffice? There is pain now. He says, we have suffered a long time now. But he says, when will it all get weightage? When will it all get the desired result? That is heaven's part, our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names a child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. He says that is heaven's part, The heavens part, he says, it only heaven can change their hearts, the hearts of the British rulers. He says only heaven, only God can do justice now. Our part is to murmur name upon name as a mother names a child when sleep at last has come on limbs. He says, he compares, now he builds an image of a woman of a mother trying to soothe her child to sleep. He says, so our part is to murmur name like the mother calling, singing softly, soft songs to her child's ear to make her go to sleep. He says, in the same way we too can hope, and we too can talk about the sacrifices, talk about the people who have lain their lives for the freedom struggle, and we can only count our dead ones. We can carry the dead bodies, carry the weights of the dead bodies, and we can count their names, and with this we can get strength. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. Now he's talking about all those things that were talked about after the uprising, whether it was a needful death, whether it was a needful sacrifice, whether it should have been, it was a wise step to take or not. So all that debate in the press after the uprising was unsuccessful. He says, was it but nightfall? No, no, but not night but death. He says, we cannot say that the uprising had resulted in nightfall, but there will be more misery for Ireland. He says, but it resulted in death. But then he says, was it needless death after all? Was that death needless? Did their sacrifices go in vain? Were there sacrifices for no gain, for no purpose? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. Now he's cherishing that hope that even after this rebellion, after the war, First World War has ended, England may grant them the home rule. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead, and what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? Now he says, we know why they died. We know what they died fighting for. We know their dream. And now he pays tribute to their dreams. He says, at least they were dreamers. At least they died fighting for a cause. At least they died fighting for their dream. So they were martyrs. Their death is not a normal death. Their death is not an ordinary death, but theirs is a death of a dreamer. Theirs is a death of martyrs. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? And he says, there is a question, but he says they died because of excess love for their country. He says those people who are saying that they should not have done this, he says they took this step because of their too much love for their country. So he says this was an act which was for the love of the country, so it is commendable. I write it out in a verse, MacDonnell and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be. Now he's addressing these people. He takes their names. He says, I'm writing out it clearly, your names, MacDonnell, McBride and Connolly and Pierce. Now he names them and he addresses them. He says, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. He says, he tells those people, he addresses them, that now and for times to come, things have changed. You shall always be remembered. Your name shall always come up whenever or wherever Ireland is talked about or mentioned, because green is the national color of Ireland. He says, wherever green is worn, wherever Ireland is represented, he says, you shall be remembered because of your contribution to the Irish nationalist cause, to the Irish freedom struggle, because you have written this freedom struggle with your own blood. You have laid down your dreams for your own country. So you have laid down your own lives for your own country, and your love for your country has survived. Your love actually have made you martyrs, and you're not ordinary people now. And then he again repeats the same line, a terrible beauty is born. So what he's done here in the poem is that he's paid tribute, a high tribute to those people who took part in the uprising or in the rebellion of the Easter 1916. And when he pays them this high tribute, he pays this tribute because they laid their lives down for the love of their country, because they wrote history with their own bloods. And it was for a cause, and because their death was for a cause, Yeats calls it heroic. He calls them martyrs. He calls them heroes, because he says they will never be forgotten now. Wherever Ireland is represented around the world, they too shall be remembered. So it is a form, the poem is a form of a eulogy, a praise for those who died in the April uprising. But it also reflects the ambivalent attitude of the poet about the uprising, because it failed to achieve its objective and it resulted in the unnecessary deaths. Although Yeats does believe that this was meaningless act, that their deaths were unnecessary, that they were not required, because he does say that if these people had lived on, in stanza 2, when he talks about the two teachers, he says if they had lived on, they would have gone on to become much more famous. They would have achieved greater things in their lives. They may have been able to do more for their country. Yet at the same time, he cannot ignore their sacrifice. He cannot ignore their love which they had for the country. So he pays tribute to them. So we see this this ambivalent attitude in the poem, where he is praising their sacrifice, but at the same time feeling that it was unnecessary, it was unrequired, it was uncalled for. And the act is described both as heroic and trouble, which is the main theme of the poem. As you can see that in the last line of every stanza is the same, and he says, a terrible beauty is born. So the rebellion is described both as heroic and at the same time as terrible, something that inspires terror and awe in us. So that is the first poem of Yeats that I discussed with you today. And the poem, as you can see, is historical in nature. It talks about a historic event in the Irish history, and it talks about the people whom Yeats personally knew, and he had met those people, and that is why he feels when he loses them. I think I forgot to mention, but these people were captured at the end of the rebellion. The leaders were captured. They were imprisoned, and after a week or after 10 days, they were all given death sentence, and they were shot dead. So in that sense, their deaths became heroic deaths for the Irish citizens and for Irish people, and also for Yeats, because Britain government had dealt cruelly and terribly with them, and it had tried to suppress the voice of the Irish people through the military power, and it was that exactly which Irish people and Irish citizens, and Yeats in particular, resented. The might of the military, the might of the British government, which it exhibited against these few innocent people, few innocent Irish people. You can compare it to, I don't want to make it controversial, but not so far back in our own history, we had that one event about this Lal Masjid event in our own history recently. But we saw that people also, after that event, they also shared that ambivalent attitude towards it. They had that ambivalent feeling towards it. For some it was a glorious event, a heroic event, but for some it was a meaningless and unnecessary event, because the people in the mosque, they took things in their own hands, and the government decided to take military action against them. So that act made those people heroic and made them heroes, because it was the might of the military against which the people, most of Pakistanis resented. So it is a similar kind of feeling that is evoked by Yeats here. The ruthless power of a dominant group against a minor and a weaker group is always resented by the sensitive people and the rationalist people. So it is this what we see is being resented by Yeats here, and he wants to show that there could have been a better approach taken up by the British government if it had wanted to show that it was true to the cause of the Irish people, that it wanted to solve their problems. But by taking that act, military action against rebels, it had shown that it was never sincere to their cause. So Yeats describes to us his own friends, and how the event had changed the course of its history, how later rebellions will always look towards this rebellion and see it as an inspiration for their own cause and struggle. So with this we come to the close of today's lecture. In the next lecture I will look at some other poems by Yeats, and I take leave from you now, and I shall meet you again in the next lecture. Thank you.